The Americans actually were settling into lands of Mexico. And that created, of course, that huge war. It was settled with the Treaty of Guadalupe. And of course, from that treaty, the United States inherited all of what becomes the Southwest United States, including California, which is then taken. So again, when you think about places like California, well, I'm a native Californian. And you know, you have all these illegal immigrants coming into California, so-called Mexicans. Well, that, I mean, historically, that area was part of Mexico a lot longer. In fact, it's been part of the United States. Don't you remember that? And yet, the mythology, again, of identity is one that becomes constructed, where you're trying to remove that, erase that story, not recognizing California wasn't just California as part of the United States. That comes to a particular history, and in fact, war, in which the California territory becomes part of the United States after the Treaty of Guadalupe. Okay. Critical myth. A myth is an interpretation of what the myth maker, rightly or wrongly, takes to be hard fact. My point is to understand it has nothing to do with what is true. It's what they want it to be true. See, that's the difference. But by the fact that it is believed to be true again, believed to be true. Well, let's look at some mythologies. As the great John Henrik Clarke, great African historian, says, powerful people cannot afford to educate the people that they oppress. Because once you are truly educated, you will not ask for power. You will take it. See, once you see your history and you see yourself in human sense, as Hawaiians, we are human beings. I have no need to convince you of my humanity. I will demand my humanity. I will not accept anything less. You see, once you start to educate yourself to see yourself in the manner I said here, you're not going to beg anymore. You act in that manner. Well, let's start off with this first mythology. Again, you get mad. Too bad, as I said. But of course, the first one, who built the Great Pyramids? Well, let's go look at Hollywood's version of this story, images. And of course, in the top left corner, we see that slide there. To the far left, who's that character? Moses. You sure? That's what the movie said. That's Moses. How about the guy next to Moses? Yul Brynner. That's Ramses. Yeah, and in the story, the mythology, where does Moses come from in the story? Where does he come from? The river. Which river? The Nile. Which river?
Nile.
You remember that now. Which river? Okay. Yeah, and Moses, the so-called adoptive mother, is supposedly a sister of Pharaoh. She raises him as her son. And they raise like brothers in the household under Seti. That guy. That's the Hollywood version. Yeah. And Seti loves Moses because, man, Moses is such a great guy. He listens. He's a warrior. He does all those things. Now, Ramses, tough dude, but he's kind of a little bit more. There's a harder side to him. And so, of course, in the story, Moses is the one who leads these people, the Israelites, out of bondage. And we look at cartoon figures. Check out this one here. That's the images we get bombarded with in our brains, thinking, these guys must know something we don't know. So who built the Great Pyramids? The Great Pyramids of Giza, for example. Well, of course, the answer is, who are the Egyptians? Somebody, should I go back to the first one? Okay, now go back again. I wonder which one is Moses. Even the National Geographic had to admit that we talk about ancient Egypt. The farther back you look into ancient Egypt, the darker they are. That is a fact. In fact, they never really start to lighten up the color until several hundred years BC. after the Assyrians came and conquered part of Egypt. But the black pharaohs, I mean, you can look at the photo. I mean, check these women out. Check this guy. That's like Denzel Washington right here already. But think again how powerful those images are. Why did Hollywood give us the other image? There's more images. Check these out here. I mean, check that guy out. It's like one of the rappers I see right now. I mean, you know, look at that beard, that hair, that fro. I mean, check out these women. More. Continue. Well, we should remember, where is Egypt? Africa. And this is I hear sometimes. This is from professors. But collect what? Egypt isn't really African. Huh? You see how powerful that idea that they cannot put it together. In fact, psychologists call that cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is even when you show up the truth is so powerful, they gotta find ways to like ignore the truth. Because their mind has been so warped by the narrative, the political mythologies, that they're unable to reconcile the truth. Yes, let's go back in. Egypt is in Africa. Next one. But let's also be reminded, the Great Pyramids up to the north are in Africa. But if you were to follow the Nile, what direction does the Nile flow? From south to north. It's one of the few great rivers that actually goes from south to north. So let's go back to the Moses story. Which direction did it flow? From south to north. When you ask the Egyptians in their own documents, they tell you, where did they come from? From south to north. And in fact, if the farther south you go, the older, I repeat, the farther south you go, the older the artifacts you find in regards to these Egyptian peoples, which are the traditional name called the Kemet, or Kemetic peoples. And you can see these two pictures here, and you can see again the locations of these. But the question is, why is that such a big deal? Why is it such a big deal that the Egyptians were Africans? Why? Why is it a problem for Africans building the pyramids?
Because they were so technologically advanced.
Correct. And if they were technologically advanced, therefore,
they were smart.
Civilization comes from where?
Africa.
Africa. You see, because the mythology is, you Hawaiians, you're lucky, man, those missionaries came from America and the Europeans who brought civilization to you. Writing was created thousands of years ago for the first European ever looked at a so-called book. And we can go to a place like Phoenicians and others in that area, besides the Egyptians. We're going to talk about high mathematics and algebra comes from these areas. You want to talk about astronomy and the great sciences, it comes from these areas. So we got to understand humanity. Who else comes from Egypt? Well, I'll get back to that. Sorry. So again, I said, if you look at here, you notice the white, the Nile River, you have the blue Nile and the white. I want you to look. Where does the river start? Where is Lake Victoria? Uganda. That's as black African as you can get. Above Uganda, you notice Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt. And I'll talk about Sudan, Ethiopia real soon. Next one. The so-called Kemet people, then later called by the Greeks, Agapitos, we become the Egyptians. But the ancient name of this place, in fact, was Kemet. In fact, the word itself means black land. Now look at these, some of the earliest pictures of the African religion with Osiris and Isis. And you know that we can look at them very closely and you can see the images. When you talk about Isis, I remember when I was growing up, there was a 70s TV show with Isis. How many of you guys remember that Isis kind of Wonder Woman show? I know she never looked like that. I think she looked like she came from California or someplace. But let's look at the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Great Pyramid. Well, we know it's for Khufu. Now, there's a little bit of this, discrepancy in regards, was it built before Khufu? Was it completed with Khufu? Started with Khufu? And what I was told, that just this pyramid, just this one, if they were able to put 10 of those blocks in every day, huge blocks, align it perfectly, just 10 a day would take over 600 years to complete this pyramid alone. So going back to technology, this is some badass technology. They knew something that we don't know. Today, of course, what's the coming? Oh, could have been Africans, must have been aliens or something. They come up with, these ideas. This is now, look at the date, 2500 BCE. Added to our 2000, you talk over 4,500 years ago. I repeat, over 4,500 years ago, this was created. And in fact, was the tallest man-made structure for over 4,000 years. Think about that. 4,000 years. It reigned as the most supreme structure. Think about that, how advanced technologically they must have been to have been able to create one of the 7 wonders of the world, which still stands. And that's the question, why is there this controversy? Well, of course, I would say quickly scientific racism. In fact, as an example, even in 1974, there was held a UNESCO conference to deal with this question. They were getting nervous. And 90% of those who attended rejected this Black Egyptian theory. This is as of 1974. Now, this is pre-DNA and all that kind of thing. Now it's a different story. Now they cannot deny when you actually look at the data. But think about it. Even in 1974, the so-called greats of the minds of the world still refused to acknowledge the Kemetic history of Egypt. Some more examples. These are Nubians paying tribute to Ramses. Remember the name Ramses? They talk about Nubian Egypt, which in fact wasn't even the original rulers of Egypt. They conquered Egypt later. So just to show there are different peoples within this area in which different people ruled at different times. But it's very clear, when you look at those images, these are not people that was a little dark, sometimes you see, but in fact, very dark. And you can look at their hairstyles. Kind of tells you a little about who they were as a people. Well, let's not stop there. Let's keep on going. We talk about the Cush people. Well, who are the Cush people? Well, biblical people would know the first country named in the Bible. In fact, it's Ethiopia. And the Cush people originated from Ethiopia. And you might say, so what, Kaliko? Well, it says in Genesis itself, the name of the second river is Gihon. It winds through the entire land of Cush. So we look at Genesis, and they talk about the so-called Garden of Eden in that mythology. And they say, where was the Garden of Eden? And he talks about this place of Cush. Well, where is Cush? And in fact, secondly, to add to that, Moses married, his wife was what's called a Cushite. Moses was from where again? He's Egypt. But his wife was Cushite. Just to be clear, Cushite people are south of the people of Egypt. You don't believe me? I didn't make up this map. I'm just trying to explain to you guys. As you can see in this map here, in Africa, these are the Cush lands, the Cush people. So even when we look at Moses, yes, okay, he's Egyptian. But maybe his wife wasn't. Sorry. His wife was even more African, if you can use that word, more African than Moses himself. Just think about that. So we talk about religion. We talk about the mythology, going back to the images of Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner. Kind of makes you wonder why those images were so important. And in fact, even worse today, knowing all of this, why would anybody feel uncomfortable? What is it? What has been put into our brains to make us feel this way? We can talk about the Sphinx, which even to this day, people talk about the Sphinx as even one of the great wonders itself. Now, what's even more amazing about the Sphinx, geologists say that the Sphinx, in fact, is older than the pyramids. And as little as 5,000 years older than the pyramids. Holy smokes, I wonder who put that there. What's even more worse or controversial is the erosion of the Sphinx. And there are many geologists today who say, when you actually look at the Sphinx and the erosion, you realize most of the erosion, in fact, is not by wind and sand. Many say it's actually from water. But the problem is, there's no water today in that area. Now you kind of got to look back in time and figure where's the water in that area? And you find it goes back a lot farther. Now, I don't have the answers. I'm just trying to explain to you guys. There's a lot more that we don't know. See, maybe we're like in 1974, just like those fools in 1974. With the limited knowledge, you guess. But as you start to get more and more knowledge, you see, the truth becomes clearer and clearer. When you look at pyramids, when you look at sphinxes, people talk about the one at the towers of, at Giza. But reality, sphinxes are all over Africa. In fact, you have more sphinxes in places like Sudan than you have in Egypt. I repeat, you have more sphinxes in Sudan than you have in Egypt. How many sphinxes you find in Europe? How many pyramids you find in Europe? And some people still going to argue that it's actually created still by Europeans. In fact, there's another picture that you can see, not just one, they get whole rows of sphinxes in these areas. And you go to Las Vegas and you see the main sphinx over there. Check out his face. It's telling. I mean, they didn't really put makeup on this one. Change the face. And of course, that's the question. How come? Why is that mythology? How come we've been fed this kind of garbage? Fakery. So you make the Sphinx in Las Vegas look like it came from, I don't know, a town in Brussels or something. I don't know, some guy out there. How come? What is the message? What is it trying to say?
Control, division.
We can go to the Valley of the Kings and you can see ancient areas and Thebes and so forth. And you can see many of these images again. And you can clearly see they're African with the hieroglyphs and their religion and so forth. We can go to Luxor. And of course, you can see that even the Egyptians can go copy the Washington Monument to go build their, the obelisk. But I want you to think about that. In Washington, D.C., this is a copy of the original, just like the one you found in Vegas with the Sphinx. These are ancient symbols. In fact, it's a symbol it's a phallic symbol for male sexuality. Sorry. And of course, this is the one in Washington, D.C. And if you look, that's the male symbol. And you can check this out. What is this here? That's the female symbol. Now you might look at it and say, wow, I wonder, could it just be by chance that they came up with the exact same kind of ideas? Or is it more probable that they just straight out ripped it off and copied from the Egyptians? And then you got to answer the question, how come? What did the Egyptians represent? What does the knowledge represent? Again, more of this. Okay, so go back. Sorry. Go back. Sorry. Go ahead.
Or if there was a similar power structure and lineage that was carried through from them.
Perhaps. I don't have information. If I ever find the evidence, I'll put it out there, that's for sure. But these are things, even what we call a precession of equinoxes. And for me, so I'll talk very briefly about this, but even within the Hawaiian Kumulipo, a genealogical chant, you find references to this idea of what's called the wobble of the earth as it moves. It's an astronomical event, and in fact, as you can see, the house of the sun, it moves it, and it takes roughly, as you can see the number, about 25,000 years, was 26,000 years for the sun to do a complete movement. Well, again, we're moving also, yeah, around into all the houses. Well, how did our people, even Hawaiians, how did we know this? How did we know this kind of scientific knowledge? This came with us, ancient times. And these you find encoded even within. I don't have time to go through this, but if you're interested, I'll suggest you go check it out. A lot of stuff about the precession equinox. Now, the mathematical about the pyramids, it's not just the physical creation of the pyramids that's amazing. If you actually went to study the mathematics surrounding the pyramids, that's even more amazing. Not just that they created it physically, but they were able to express high mathematics in the construction of it. It's beyond, you know. I don't have time to go through everything, so you got to take my class to get more of that. We can talk about the Eye of Horus. Of course, becomes a symbol of medicine, the Auric symbol. Of course, you know that this is really a formula for mathematics to account its iteration. In fact, this equals, if you add up all these fractions, it equals 63 out of 64. People in Hawaiian studies, again, like the Kumulipo, realize what is the 63? As a symbol, of course, you'll notice that's a number that's even in the Kumulipo, in regards to the 7 wa po and the 9 wa lao. So even within our own understanding of the universe, even in our own chants, we encoded these ancient knowledges like the Egyptians also. The so-called Eye of Horus, you know, what does it mean? Of course, today people talk about the pineal gland and the so-called third eye and these, you know, the representation of God, the representation of spirituality. These are things that are totally encoded within these ancient knowledges itself. And so these are things that we, to this day, we understand and we see the symbolism all over the place that goes back all the way to ancient Egypt. Yeah, I don't have time to go through all of these, but can I continue? Oh, go back one more. Even the great Da Vinci, just to understand, you know, we talk about that particular symbolism, mathematics. They were encoded even within his artwork. And of course, we got to understand, why would it be hard for Da Vinci to talk about mathematics and science in a godly way? What is wrong with, why didn't Da Vinci just kind of come out about his knowledge of science and mathematics?
They would have killed him.
They would have killed him. Who would have killed him?
Vatican.
The church, the Vatican specifically. So a way to express their knowledge, in fact, art was a way common in which they would basically say, I know mathematics. And so that those in the know, they knew, they would see the artwork and they knew in this language of mathematics and artwork. So even people like Da Vinci were encoded this in. So again, my point is to understand these are ancient knowledges that are within even art, within the sciences. In fact, just kind of step back, when you look at Egyptian sciences, and you actually study Egyptian religion, what you actually find, it's kind of sad today when you look at this fight between science and religion as it's kind of portrayed. But if you look at ancient Egyptian and Kemetic knowledges, science, in fact, was the expression of religion. Sciences were the gods. Science and mathematics was the explanation for divinity. It wasn't a separation of divinity and science. Science helped to explain divinity. So what they saw God was is mathematical formulas that they saw all over the world. We talk about the images. Remember the one I talked about with
Obelisk.
this is Pisces, and of course with the obelisk. Well, again, these are all ancient and going back to, you know, it's the woman with a fish on the head and so forth. But you know, one of the images, of course, that represents Christianity. But then again, these are symbols that even are more ancient than Christianity have been used. And of course, it's the power of females. And what power do females have? The power of birth, power of life.
Creation.
Okay. And creation, exactly. Well, let's kind of look at a little bit of Kemet history. Move real quickly, sorry. Earliest hieroglyphs, 3400 BCE. That's over 5,500 years ago. Unification of Egypt, that's 31. That's over 5,000 years ago. First pyramid construction, again, 2630 BCE. Khufu was buried in there. Thutmose, actually, just to kind of say, when you talk about Egypt, we can also remember Egypt also was a conquering nation and actually spread its influence and its society into many areas. And just example on the Thutmose, where much of all of Palestine after Syria, in fact, down to Nubia, was all under Egyptian control at one time also. And Amenhotep, in fact, is a person that introduces the idea of monotheism. And it wasn't only to 671 that the first Assyrians actually have conquered Egypt for sure. Again, the founding king of Egypt, just to look back, and you can see his facial pictures, features I should say. But he's the first emperor, and he unified what was the southern and the northern part of Egypt into one kingdom. We look at the 42 laws of Ma'at, which are ancient religious texts, also called the Book of the Dead, also called the negative confessions. And this really, confession was, I will not do this, I did not do this, I did not do this. It wasn't just 10 commandments that they had, but in the Egyptian, they had actually 42. And let's be clear that all 10 that you find within the Judeo-Christian viewpoint, all 10 was part of the 42. Now, where did Moses, where was Moses raised again? Egypt. And just believe, Moses comes to life roughly about over 1,000 years after these confessions that had already been created. And let's step back and go over. Where did Moses get the 10 commandments from?
Mount Sinai.
Where's Mount Sinai? Sure. You'd actually look and you find the argument is actually still in Africa.
I watched a documentary where they were trying to find it. And they couldn't find it.
Yeah. Which is part of the mythology, you see too. But if you actually look at where Moses' wife is from, and, you add up all those stories. My point is to understand there's a lot of the story that we think we know, but we don't really know. But again, go back. So you notice that even this idea of when you pass on, and when you, at your death, your life will be weighed against a feather, and you'll be judged on how well you lived your life, so that you can pass on or not. The concept of an afterlife was something that was thousands of years even before the idea of a Moses ever walking upon the earth. We can look at biblical ideas of Joseph, and I thought I just chose this picture. There's a particular story of Joseph, and of course Joseph is the one who, if I remember right, he's kidnapped and he ends up in Egypt, and he has this way of reading the dreams of the king, or the Pharaoh. But again, look at the Pharaoh looked that way. Obviously, you can figure Joseph probably never looked like that either. But again, these are images that you find throughout Europe. This is King Tut. This is an image actually of King Tut. Seti, remember Seti? Seti was the father of Ramses. That's it. That's Seti. So you can figure if he looked like that, I wonder what Ramses looked like. There's images of Ramses. Therefore, I wonder what Moses looked like. I guarantee you he did not look like Charlton Heston. I guarantee you he looked a lot more like darker than Barack Obama, that's for sure. Yeah, maybe I don't know, another James Earl Jones, what do you think? Something like that. Okay. Well, we can even look at early Judaism just to kind of understand the connections, the influences. Hezekiah, who's a well-known king of the Judaism history. And Hezekiah, of course, is one of those who kind of seen it, really one of the fathers of Judaism. And there's a fight that goes on about the connection between Judaism and Egypt. And for far too long, there was this kind of like discounting and even non-acceptance of the connection. Well, I just want to show you, this is actually the last couple of years this was found. And in doing a dig in Jerusalem and looking up, they found a coin that was in honor of Hezekiah himself. Hezekiah's coin. Like you see George Washington on a bill, or you see, on our coins, you get an important person imprinted image. Well, Hezekiah is interesting. When you actually look at Hezekiah, what do you guys see on the side there, imprinted? The Ankh. Where do you find the Ankh?
Egypt.
Egypt. Even one of the most important kings of Judaism, on his official coinage, he has the Ankh symbols, which are ancient symbols, thousands of years even before Hezekiah. So my point is to be clear, You can deny it or not, but the point is, I can prove to you that there are ancient Kemetic symbols even on Hezekiah's coinage. Of course, I didn't find the coin itself, but wow, look at this. Oh, beautiful, beautiful woman. Cleopatra. Well, that's the Hollywood version. You notice her braids. You ask yourself, why did they braid her hair? Because the real Cleopatra had what kind of hair? African hair, clearly. But you know, Cleopatra was seen as being mixed also, just to be clear. She was like the Halle Berry of her time, maybe. I don't know, mixed. But still African, that's the point. So what is this religious mythology we're talking about? And what does it mean? Why is it such a radical idea? Well, we can even look, if you don't believe in Kaliko, you can read books like Black Athena, which are also important in arguing even Greece. When you talk about Greece, see, Greece is kind of seen as Europeans like the fatherland. This is like the foundation of European philosophers and European ideals and democracy, Plato and Socrates and so forth. But even the Greeks themselves, where did the Greeks get this knowledge? Well, all you gotta do is look at a map. Look at the map and look, where is Greece? And right across the Mediterranean is what? Egypt. Still don't believe me? Well, this book might change your mind, but what? Let's look at Herodotus. Herodotus, the father of history. One of the greats of Greek historians, the father of history. Well, what does he say? And look when he lived. He lived about 480 years BC. Way after the so-called Egyptians. And he says, the people of Colchis must be Egyptians because like them, they are black-skinned and woolly-haired. Their own historians are telling them that Egyptians were black. The uniform voice of primitive antiquity spoke of the Ethiopians as one single race dwelling along the shores of the Southern Ocean from India to the Pillars of Hercules. What is the Pillars of Hercules? I want you to talk about it. This is what Herodotus said. From India to the Pillars of Hercules. Now we can look at Aristotle. Egyptians and Ethiopians were very black. That's his own language. Hold on, come on. Father of medicine, Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath. Yeah, and they said he is the father of medicine, 460 BC. Next one. Oh, no, not really. Imhotep, in fact, was considered father of medicine. 2650 BCE. 2,000 years. 2,000 years before him. He was, in fact, known as the first one to study the effects of different kind of medicines and treating the body and so forth. But see, we get sold the idea that the Greeks began much of this knowledge, when in fact, the Greeks only borrowed, again, from the Africans. Well, let's look at Hegel, the great German philosopher, probably one of the brilliant minds of his time. How did he see Africa? See, this kind of answers the question. And as he says, Hegel says, at this point we leave Africa, not to mention it again. For it is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. Africa is the unhistorical, underdeveloped spirit still involved in the conditions of mere nature. But you can see, even by the time where Hegel comes about in Europe, he looked at places like Africa void of any kind of humanity. Yet, that was not the truth at all. Now we talked about Adam and Eve. So I asked you guys earlier, who is Eve? And you guys say Adam and Eve? Well, this is what Newsweek is saying. Now, why would I make this point? Well, let's look at the Last Supper also. This is Da Vinci. When did he paint this?
1500.
In the 1500s. How many years after supposedly this event occurred? 1500 years later. We are closer to them today than they were to the event. This is not a Polaroid snapshot shot of what exactly occurred. This is a European painting a picture with European faces of an event that happened 1,500 years before him. And yet, the confusion, people look at this as somehow it's some kind of holy image, as if there's some kind of truth in this image. Now, I'm not saying the story is not true. My point to argue, of course, there's no way you're going to tell me that's what they look like, knowing the facts that I understand. And there's a reason why this image affects many of us today. Well, who it is? Who's this over here? Kind of like Bob Marley, this one. As I understand, this is one of the most earliest images painted of Jesus in the 2nd century. 1,300 years before Da Vinci. I wonder which one knew more of the truth. The one that was closer to the event, found in that area, or the one 1,500 years later they didn't invent, found further away. So even the images that control our minds, and you ask the question, so what? Why is it shocking? Why is it causes confusion and feeling funky about it? What has been programmed in our minds to make us think and accept particular things? See, I believe this. If the world understood this, I think so-called real Christians would look at the world in a very different way. If they realize that the so-called Lord that they pray to look this way, they might look at the world in a very different way, perhaps. Well, let's not stop there. You can go and look at the earliest images of Jesus and Mary. And the earlier you look, the darker they are. That's a fact. Not going to force truth. And you can even look at the ancient Egypt stories of Horus. These are some of the most earliest images that you'll find of Jesus. In fact, this is one of the earliest paintings. This is what's called the Black Madonna. Some of you might be known. If you went to the Vatican and you wonder, I wonder where does the Pope pray? This is the image that he prays to, that you find in the Vatican. It's not that the wood happened to be very dark and so they made it that way, whatever. So I want you guys to understand, this is part of understanding history. See, at one time, color wasn't really a big deal. Color became a big deal when slavery came around. Let's look at Africa and the history of people. Well, we know there's the same science that Africans moved out. Yeah, but 100,000 years ago, we started to move as peoples and we migrated out. And Mendel's, what does Mendel's law basically say?
Darker dominance.
Darker is dominant. Do we go from blonde-haired, blue-eyed Adam and Eve to black people, or do we go from black people to blonde-haired, blue-eyed people? Meaning, we all descend physically from whom? African people. That's a scientific idea. Now, the only way you can pretend the science doesn't work is to say, I'm not going to look at the data, I'm going to create some other kind of idea, I'm going to make myself a painting and I'm going to believe what I see in this image of the painting. The point is, even science tells us this. As I said, we are all Africans. Mama Africa, as Bob Marley said. Okay. Even the pharaohs, they had to do x-rays and DNA. And they come up with the idea. The analysis that, oh yeah, after all, they were African people. We were wrong. So the question of who does this benefit? Why do we continue and accept these lies? Why not tell the truth? Who does it hurt? Who does it empower? Who does it disempower? Well, let's not stop just with Moses. We can look at other religions. I can look at the Hindus. You remember at one time Ethiopians and Africans controlled all the way to India. These are some of the earliest forms of some of the Hindu gods. And they get some color also. This is one of the earliest physical sculptures of the Buddha. Check out that here. Check out that eye. So even Buddhism has images that have changed and shifted through time. Other images of Buddha, as you can see, even check that out with his hair. And of course, Buddha, he wasn't a Nazi back then. This is an ancient symbol that was later taken by the Third Reich, and images were used. But because the reason why they stole those images, because these are very ancient images that had particular ideas from ancient times. Sorry, go ahead, sir. So we'll leave Africa. We'll run around quickly to this next one. Well, the next bit, who discovered America? For today, of course. And of course, Christopher Columbus did, right? 1492. That's what we're told. Well, of course not. We had American Indians and other natives, the Taino and Arawak and other people in the Caribbean for thousands of years prior to any coming of any Columbus. Columbus, of course, is important in that he begins Spanish colonization of those lands. He symbolizes conquest and genocide. He is the creator of what becomes the transatlantic slave trade. And he has killed millions, in fact, under his reign. If you can look, the estimates are, by 1496, look at these numbers. They came in 1492. Millions of people in that era had already been killed. Well, who's Christopher Columbus? What did they say? These are some of his own words. If your majesties do wish, all can be carried to Spain or made slaves on their island. And we get told he came in friendship and sailed the ocean blue and so forth. In 1490, he wrote that 4,000 slaves a year could be shipped to Spain. In fact, that's what they did. Well, 6,000, I understand, just from his time were shipped to Spain for slaves. And this is an image. What do you see going on there? What's happening there?
Dogs are eating.
The dogs are eating the so-called natives, which is a common activity for the Spanish under Columbus. Well, thankfully, we had Bartolome de las Casas who documented and explained some of that history. And you can see during Columbus's tenure as governor, hanging Tainos en masse, hanging them first of all, then roasting them on spits or burning them at the stake, hacking their children into pieces to be used as dog feed, to instill in the natives a proper attitude of respect toward the Spanish superiors. Now, these are not drawings that Kalikoa did. These are actually drawings that the Spanish themselves did, documenting. Before they had the selfies and they were able to document, they actually would actually draw those images. But if you take a look at it, you'll see people being maimed, hands being cut off, eyes being dug out, and ears being cut off. The kind of cruelty was performed by Columbus and the conquistadors was never seen beforehand in that part of the world. We can also see other examples. Crushed to earth by the horses, cut in pieces by swords, eaten and torn by dogs, many burned alive. And if you actually look at this, these are part of the most horrendous pictures that you'll find at that time also. And on top, of course, you see feeding babies to the man-eating dogs and hanging that little baby next to his mother. And of course, the common thing they favored, like besides bashing babies onto rocks, was to physically burn them hanging alive. And in fact, they would burn and kill 13. 1 for the Savior, 12 for the disciples. Now just to remind us, this is all before ISIS was all around. That is Columbus. Holiday? He's just this great explorer. This is what we're told. Of course, none of this is true at all. And yet this country still celebrates it as a core understanding of being an American. And I asked that question, how can that be? How can Columbus still hold that supposed prestigious position of somehow being a holiday for the United States, knowing these facts about Columbus. Well, let's stop at Columbus. Let's move on to the Thanksgiving. You know, we told the story, right? The Pilgrims, persecuted, religious persecution, leave Europe, head to the New World, Providence, for love of their God. They come upon the land, and of course, the Thanksgiving feast story. God provides it. Well, how many of you guys know the true story of the Pilgrims? They land, well, supposedly Plymouth Rock as the mythology goes. And they said that the first thing they do is that they kneel and they pray. And after they pray, they climb up this sand hill. And in this large sand dune hill, they find all these native graves. Hundreds, or if not thousands, of natives who had died 20 years before in mass epidemics when settlers actually tried to live there earlier. And the first thing that they did was to say, wow, we have such a great God. Look what he gave us, all these things to dig up and find. So the first thing they actually did was to dig up the graves and take all those trinkets that they could find. And grave rob was the first thing the so-called Pilgrims did when they came to the Americas. And of course, then they set up their house to stay and live. Unfortunately, many of them never lived out in the so-called open before, in a cruel winter. And about half of the so-called Pilgrims died that first winter from starvation. The other half didn't starve. But let's just be clear, they weren't eating pumpkin pie and corn and turkey during the winter. I wonder what they were eating to survive. They're eating each other. Funny, don't tell us that part of the Thanksgiving story. And fortunately for them, if you watch the Disney version, you get Squanto comes along and teaches them how to fish and farm and to prepare for the following winter, which they do. And they survive, and they have this great lifestyle that's developed. And it's the idea that they become friends. The Indians teach them how to survive, and they share, and they sit down, and they have Thanksgiving dinner. Well, that's not really the true Thanksgiving story. 20 years later, the so-called Pilgrims, after being helped by the natives of that land, go to war with them. And we have things like the Mystic Massacre and even the Pequot Massacre, with a large attack upon them. And as you can see this picture here, they surround them and they virtually burn them out of their villages. Men, women, children, the old, the young. And as he says here, the inhabitants remaining were largely Pequot women and children and older men. Mason ordered that the enclosure be set on fire. Justifying his conduct later, Mason declared that the attack against the Pequot was an act of a God who laughed his enemies and the enemies of his people to scorn, making the Pequot as a fiery oven. Thus did the Lord judge among the heathen, filling with dead bodies. Mason insisted that any Pequot attempting to escape the flames should be killed. Go to the next, the Pequot Massacre. This is William Bradford, the original, I repeat, this is the original proclamation of Thanksgiving before it becomes a holiday. And he says in 1637, quote, those that scraped the fire were slain with the sword. Some hewed to pieces, others ruined thrown with their rapiers, so as they were quickly dispatched, and very few escaped it. It was conceived that they thus destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same. And horrible was the stink and the scent thereof. But the victory seemed the sweet sacrifice, and they gave their prayers thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them. Thus they closed their enemies in their hands, and gave them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy. That's part of the first original Thanksgiving. So when we think about Thanksgiving, we get the Hollywood version again of Thanksgiving. I mean, I like the day off. I don't think there's nothing wrong with giving Thanksgiving. But if we somehow believe that Thanksgiving has to do with some kind of image that we just saw previously, see, that's part of the cruelty of history. that perhaps if we really understand the kind of cruelty that were put upon the Pequot and Native brothers of those lands, perhaps we might have a little more humanity for their way of life today. Now, let's not stop there. Of course, we can talk about the Salem witch hunts. And the reason I talk about this is because this is the common one for Hawaiians. You know, Kaleko, you're lucky the missionaries came. You know, you women were oppressed under the kapu system. You know, they couldn't eat coconuts, couldn't eat pig. They were oppressed by their men. And of course, the answer is, not eating coconuts is one thing. I don't know about being burned at the stake. So who, I mean, the idea that some of our women were oppressed versus puritanical history of the United States, I mean, there's no comparison. We've never burnt the women at the stakes. This is part of the U.S. history, this hatefulness for women. This is something the United States is still trying to get over to this day. Well, let's look at George Washington. People talk about Washington, of course. You should remember he was a slave owner himself, 317 slaves. He had one go when he died. He began really the policies of extermination of American Indians began under George Washington. What I mean by policies, he put that into effect, actual government policies, not just of forcing to remove them, but the idea that they must exterminate American Indians. As he says here, lay waste all the settlements around, that the country may not be merely overrun, but destroyed. Well, let's not stop with, let's go to Thomas Jefferson, the supposed writer of the Declaration of Independence, the great pen. One of the wealthiest slave owners in Virginia, first of all. He freed 5 when he died. And as he says, quote, don't do it. Keep your slaves. Be a good master. And he's told, and they teach us, in fact, that, man, he was one of the greatest Americans that ever lived. Well, let's not stop with slavery. We also know, as it says here, this is your own words, the Indian resistance must be met with a hatchet. Jefferson continued, and if ever we are constrained to lift the hatchet against any tribe, he wrote, we will never lay down till that tribe is exterminated or is driven beyond the Mississippi. In war, they will kill some of us. We shall destroy all of them. Pursue the Indians to extermination. To it. What does the word exterminate mean? Where have we heard that words before? Extermination and genocide.
Oh,
Huh? The Third Reich and Hitler, you know, that bad Hitler. But let me just add, it is said under Thomas Jefferson and his policies, more natives were killed and exterminated than any other president. So we talk about Thomas Jefferson. I don't know why we don't tell the whole story. And of course, what is this picture about? His children, right? And of course, we all know he had children, one of his own slaves, Sally Hemings, who had children. And as the story goes, some of those children actually were later sold. But Sally Hemings, of course, you know, as the story also goes, he had a kind of thing for young black girls. That was his kink. That's Thomas Jefferson, the great American. And let's not, you know, think that slavery was something light. You know, the transatlantic slave trade, where you had millions, I'm not talking a few hundred, millions of Africans died just in the passage from Africa to the United States. Where you might have a cargo of human beings and half of them would die from the transfer, to be sold, to be whipped, to be killed. But there was resistance to slavery that we should also honor. One of the greatest minds ever, Frederick Douglass, great writer. Nat Turner. In fact, there's a movie about him today, Birth of a Nation. But Nat Turner is interesting. You know, as a preacher, he's one of the few blacks who actually could read. And he said, God told him, kill your master. And he went off to kill the master. He got scared. One thing is to have slaves, but now you got slaves trying to kill the master. Uh-oh. He led rebellions. And in fact, this is an ancient picture, can't really tell, but that's
John
Yeah,
Brown.
John Brown, sorry, John Brown. Who's John Brown? Abolitionist. So this is a white guy, just to be clear. This is John Brown. This is a white guy who wasn't, he couldn't stand just saying, asking to free the slaves. John Brown said, frick this, we're going to free the slaves. And he and his own family took the gun to help free the slaves. So my point is this example. This is a white person that we should look at to honor and say, yeah, we had white people who gave the life, not of himself, but even his family members, to try to end the dehumanization process of slavery. I talked about this earlier, so I'm going to skip through all this. But again, the idea is to understand the Johnson McIntosh case and how the United States creates the mythology of, again, these are Supreme Court judges, just to understand how the United States gains title and the idea of, I'll just start with this one. So these are the three main cases. It's called the Marshall Trilogy. Really the cornerstones of how the United States claims control of so-called American Indian land and the sovereignty over American Indians. First is the Johnson McIntosh case, which basically says, using a doctrine of discovery, that says, man, America was discovered fair and square by Europeans, and by the fact that these natives were heathens and they were not Christians and barbarians, because of the papal bulls, they could therefore claim these lands as their own through what's called the doctrine of discovery. That the American Indians who were living there had no right of land ownership because they're not Christians. They only had rights of occupancy. In the second case of Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, in a short, is where it provides that the United States Congress shall have plenary power, meaning these ideas are still, to this day, cornerstones of American Supreme Court jurisprudence. To this day, whenever they have cases that deal with American Indians, they still refer to these cases as precedents. I want you guys to think about that. The ideas that American Indians are heathens and savages and are barbarians and are actually less than are still today part of the judiciary, part of the decision making. So we really talk about equality. We can see even from the foundations of American justice, American Indians will not get justice. Well, let's look at Lincoln. Just a few more. And we get told, what's the mythology about Lincoln?
Great liberator.
Free the slaves, right? That's what we get told. You know, equality is, well, not really. If you actually read Lincoln and all about his history, it doesn't work that way. As he says, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. See, the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery. That's a story we get told. The Civil War was about keeping the Union intact. The question of slavery was one of the main questions. But his role in fighting the Civil War against the South wasn't to, I'm going to fight this war to protect us, to free the slaves. It was about protecting the Union. That's his own words.
The economic union, because the South, they wanted their own
Right.
economic system.
And then because of the system that they had running, the kind of cheap labor system, not to say the North didn't have a cheap labor system at the same time. I will say then that I am not, these are his own words now, nor ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes. That's his own words. Unfortunately, or unfortunately I should say, when we talk about mass hangings, the largest mass hanging that occurred was of the Sioux Indians in 1862 by Lincoln. But 38 Indians, many of them said in fact were innocent, were hung by Lincoln, by orders of Lincoln.
In Minnesota.
And this all comes to manifest destiny. This idea we talk about, and this is part of the idea under the dream, this mentality. We can see this picture here. This idea of bringing civilization across the land, chasing the Indians the buffalo way, and then bringing civilization with the locomotive and the telegraph and the Bible in one hand to bring civilization across. But this idea of the right of manifest destiny. And you got to think, what does the word mean? Manifest destiny. This is all part of God's plan. Part of God's plan is say that, yeah, we're supposed to do whatever it takes, including mayhem and murder and plundering and pillaging, to take this great country and to create this country, to spread and possess the whole continent. See, of course, what happens when they stopped in California, they didn't stop in California. And hence, of course, Hawaii becomes part of. And these are just some examples of the photos, and you can see the pictures. The idea that U.S. was a chosen land by God, conveying the idea of us a rightful destiny to take. Sorry. Let's just also just end with some of this. I'll go back to this one. Then part of the history is to understand extermination policies isn't just a policy word. Extermination policy is actually a true event, and these are just a few of the massacres. And I used to have massacres, not engagement, massacres where you come in and you kill unarmed people by the dozens, by the hundreds, from Sand Creek all the way even into 1890. Look at 1890 at Wounded Knee. Where natives were massacred and killed for their lands, killed because they were seen as savages and less than human beings. See, my thing is that manifest destiny still lives to this day. We may not see murder in that same sense, but extermination is still going on. We can look at the Trail of Tears and understand that horrific history. We can look at the idea of, this land is your land, this land is my land. This idea somehow justifies the murder and torture and destruction of the civilization. And just to show you, as much as 100 million perhaps were killed. It's not Kalekua saying this. This is a professor that's saying this. Put that into context in history and some of the worst mass murders and cases. When you put the American Indian in context, it's probably the greatest genocidal campaign ever performed. And let me just end with this idea of forced assimilation. See, once they murder you and they kill you and they beat you to submission, the final stage of extermination is not the extermination of the body, but of course, the erasure and deculturation and the destruction of your mind and soul as a people. Because once you break the spirit of the people, how therefore then you keep those people under domination? But through assimilation policies, like educational policies, that teach you that yes, you come from a people, you come from savages, you come from people who had nothing. And you should be thankful, in fact, that this history was placed upon you. And educational institutions are used in this manner to teach false histories, to teach political myths, to justify, legitimatize the kind of violence, the kind of genocidal policies that are performed on people to take. And so in the end, when we look at today, and I look at, like the struggle that Mickey was talking about earlier up in EOS, he told me this is still an extension of exactly the same thing. For Hawaiians, the fight over water is really not about water. It's really about our own humanity as a people. For we know without the water, there is no land, there is no life. We as Hawaiians will not survive without our own land and without our own water. We can call ourselves sovereign. What's good of being sovereign if I have a nice ID and I don't got no land and I got no water? Or the land that I got has been polluted with pesticides and insecticides. So really the kinds of struggles that you see going on today is still part of that struggle against this extermination. And I use the word extermination, not as a hyperbolic word. I use extermination of reality. The reality is that the system today, see, they originally had planned that we would have been gone a long time ago. The original idea was through the educational system and so forth, Hawaiians would have been converted a long time ago as proud Americans, and somehow we wouldn't say anything, we would just accept all that has been going on. Unfortunately for them, as we start to learn our language, our history, start to understand our own humanity, start realizing that we need to struggle for our own sense of who we are. We cannot help but politically start to engage, you see. And so when I look at struggles, whether it's Mauna Kea, whether it's the water, whether it was Haleakala, whether it's the GMO issue, and all those issues that Uncle Walter shared, this is, to me, a fight against ideas like extermination. And physically, and mentally, and culturally, all that has been done to our people, and American Indians, who by the time, I think in 1930, there were less than 250,000 of them that were counted from the millions. But the good news, we're still here. The good news, even with all the crap that has been put on our people, all those policies, there's not a place in the world that's as commodified as Hawaii, missionized as Hawaii, decultured in many ways, and yet our people still resist. To me, that's such an amazing idea. And as I say, even with all they put on us, the fact that we still resist is amazing. And as I always say, if that's the best they got, we already got them licked. So anyway, mahalo. If you have any ideas or questions, we can talk story. Mahalo. And if you have any questions for Uncle Walter, the general, he's here. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Oh my God, is that on?
Yeah. Yeah.